For the last decade or so, Apple generally hasn't changed the formula too much when it comes to the iMac. They've used the same design across many generations, and that kind of makes sense considering there's not nearly as much competition in the all-in-one space as there might be in laptops. Sure, you might see all-in-ones by Dell, HP, Lenovo, and even Microsoft, but they're probably not going to show up on a billboard. But this one might. For the last few weeks, I've been using the iMac 2021 as my primary desktop, and I was curious whether it made sense to have alongside something like a MacBook Air M1. And so I'll frame most of my review in terms of that. But I'll also talk a little bit about whether this makes sense as a primary computer if you don't have another computer alongside it. So without any further ado, this is InnoISO, and this is my iMac 2021 review. So let's start with the design, but let me fix something really quick. If you didn't watch my full unboxing video of the iMac 2021, then just so you know, it took me only a few seconds before I fell in love with this design. I absolutely love this bright royal blue color, but frankly, it does look a little bit better on camera than it does in person. That's not to say it looks bad in person, it's incredibly impressive, but actually when you're close up, you can see some of the fingerprints, the spots, the dust on it, a lot more so than you might be able to on camera. I really appreciate having a bright, striking color palette, which seems to be like a big departure from a lot of the more plain blacks, grays, and silvers that we've come to know and not really love from a lot of different laptops and desktops. I really appreciate this transition, and I think it will lead to more people wanting to personalize their own device. There's a bug flying around. Let's get away from here. I am also convinced that this blue color is better than any of the other colors available, and it apparently matches my eyes. So let me know down in the comments if you think. Got it. I gotta wash my hands. I am also convinced that this blue color is better than any of the other colors available, and apparently it matches my eyes. So let me know down in the comments if you think I'm wrong. But the problem lies when you actually turn the iMac around. One of the most common criticisms in the new iMac is the white bezel. Now, some reviewers have said they kind of fade into the background if you've got a white wall, and some have said that it's absolutely terrible and they should have just gone with black. I lie somewhere in the in-between. For me, I usually don't have it directly against the white wall. I usually have some space or something behind it. And so it doesn't really blend in too much, but to me, I don't think it would have made a huge difference to have black bezels, because in my mind, it doesn't really change my viewing experience. What I'm a little bit more frustrated about is the kind of off pale baby blue color along the bottom. I love the idea of a two-tone device, but in my mind, after a few years, this kind of playful baby blue is going to turn maybe a little tacky. I don't know how fashion in the future or style in the future might look, but what I know is that royal blue on the back looks very, very striking and impressive to me, whereas this baby blue looks playful and light. And I'm not sure in 5 or 6 years whether playful and light is what I'm going to want out of a desktop. As many reviewers have mentioned, that chin actually contains the bulk of the internals of the computer, which means Apple is able to achieve an incredibly thin profile. But in practice, it doesn't seem to be that practical. I'm not sure exactly why I'd want a computer to be this incredibly thin, other than just for design purposes. Now, on the design, I am overall incredibly impressed. This design looks very cohesive to the point where most other all-in-ones don't achieve, and many other laptops don't even achieve. But the problem is this is just an idea of what the iMac should look like, and not what it actually looks like after a couple weeks. This is what the iMac looks like after a couple weeks. So now let's play a quick game of spot the differences. Well, the monitor looks different, the keyboard looks different, the mouse looks different, and that beautiful blue color that we loved from before is now masked behind a mess of gray and black cabling. What happened? Well, let's start with the display. If you remember my MacBook Air review, or check it out if you haven't already, one of my biggest problems with MacBook Air was the inability for me to connect it to a normal docking station and then connect it to multiple monitors. Instead, I would be stuck with one single external monitor. Now, with the help of another docking station, a more optimized docking station, I can now connect my MacBook Air to many different monitors. And I can connect my iMac to even more monitors, or at least the same number of monitors with a bigger 24-inch monitor as the primary display. This primary display is quite impressive. They call it 4.5K, but that doesn't really matter too much to me. For me, I love the picture, I love how bright it can get, I love the color, and editing videos on this was actually a pretty good experience, with one caveat. The 24 inches of display here, I've actually been impressed with how usable they are in most cases. That might be partially because iMac displays are naturally taller than a more standard 24-inch display. But that being said, if I had my choice, I would probably opt for something larger. My primary monitor that I use is a 32-inch monitor, which has a lot more usable screen space. And so being able to dock this to many different external displays, including that 32-inch display, means that I can get the full experience out of it that I would out of just about any other PC that I might use. But of course, having additional 24 and 32-inch monitors means that I need an additional 4 cables, 2 for data, 2 for power, and the monitors themselves crowding up what was a beautiful desktop. And so that's one step. The next step, let's look at that keyboard. So the Magic Keyboard is good for a regular keyboard that comes in the box. Usually I'd expect out of most desktop PCs having pretty crappy membrane keyboards that probably could be found for about $5 to $10 at Micro Center or at Best Buy. But this kind of breaks the mold in terms of at least design. As I showed in my unboxing, there's a lot of similarities between this keyboard and the one found in the MacBook Air, which means that it is great if you are used to laptop keyboards, but in terms of having the full usable space that many people are familiar with on a desktop, it's pretty limited. I, of course, am not the biggest fan of the crunched layout, and I would prefer something with a little bit more robust features. Personally, while I don't mind the feeling of the switches, I prefer a more raised keyboard with larger keys in order to really feel the tactility. I personally use a mechanical keyboard, but that's not necessarily for everyone. That sort of feedback is what I need in order to feel like I'm doing real work, because I can actually feel when the keys respond, whereas this is a relatively light click that responds to me. And then of course there's everyone's favorite, the Magic Mouse. I know that there's a lot of memes out there about how you can't charge the Magic Mouse without flipping it on its back like a potato or a pill bug, which are obviously hilarious. But for me, that doesn't really bother me all that much. I imagine that I'm going to be charging this every couple months, and spending a couple minutes just not being able to use it because it's charging on its back, it's not going to kill me. Instead, I think where the bad design really lies is in the ergonomics. You see, this profile seems to be made for someone who has a lot smaller hands than I do. And so as a result, I have one of two options. First, I can either slide my hand behind the mouse so that my palm is resting back on the desktop, which means that it inherently takes more of my weight and my force in order to move the mouse along the surface of the desk. Or alternatively, I can crunch my hand up like a claw and try and rest my palm on the back of the mouse, which is also incredibly unergonomic. And both situations lead to me accidentally swiping on the touch-sensitive top panel. Oh yeah, and by the way, the fact that in my unboxing video I said that you need 2 fingers to scroll, you only need 1 finger to scroll. I know that was my mistake, I'm sorry. In general, the scrolling performance or experience on the Magic Mouse is not great. I don't love having to swipe along it, and it doesn't feel natural considering I have to reposition my hand in order to do so in that fancy claw fashion. I wish that this was just a fancy mouse with the scroll wheel, but unfortunately, I've got this. So the mouse is strike 2. So that takes us to strike 3, which a lot of people have already called out. It's the lack of ports. There are 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports on this base model, which is the same number of Thunderbolt 3 ports that we have on the MacBook Air. I think that obviously this is better because I don't need a port for powering the device because I've already got a power cable. And hypothetically, I don't always need a port for the display when I want to display on a bigger display because 24 inches is a lot bigger than 13 inches. But that leaves a list of all of the items that I could hypothetically plug into these ports, and I can't without a docking station. So that includes, in my standard daily workflow, 2 external hard drives, an SD card reader, 2 external display cables for my 2 monitors, a mouse dongle, and a keyboard dongle, as I've mentioned earlier, which that leaves to 7 different ports that I'll need when I only have 2. Now, if I was maybe an average Joe and I didn't really need all of that extra functionality, then I might be able to get by with simply an external mouse, because that is absolutely critical, and maybe 1 more flexible port for charging my iPhone, or maybe adding a USB external hard drive or something. I think 2 ports for the average person might be enough, depending on how much you want to leave plugged into your Mac versus hot plug in and out and swap it. If I had to guess, I'd say the average school deploying the iMac in their libraries probably wouldn't need an external docking station. I'd say that the average family might need like a small little USB hub plugged into it, and the professional might need a true docking station with many USB ports, many display out ports, which leads to the idea of this, in many different cases, is going to be significantly marred in terms of design by the presence of an external docking station or USB hub. Finally, let's get to the performance. I've been doing all of the same things on this that I was doing on my MacBook Air M1 previously, which means that yes, I was doing all my video editing on this device. And I was hoping, considering that it has an actual dedicated fan, that I'd be able to actually experience better sustained performance on this versus my MacBook Air, which might overheat due to the lack of a fan. And in practice, frankly, I didn't really tell the difference. The processor is the exact same. It also has 8 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage. So I didn't really expect that to be too different, but I had hoped that the fan might actually lead to, when I was exporting a video, it would be significantly faster and more consistent on this than the MacBook Air. I didn't really notice the difference at all. And so maybe in more frequent use cases, it would actually make a difference. But for most people, the MacBook Air, the iMac, and this device are all probably going to perform pretty similarly in most use cases. And frankly, it was hard not to be a little disappointed about it. Yes, the M1 still performs absolutely incredibly and better than most of the computers that I've used in the past, but I had hoped to have a better experience on a desktop than a small laptop that is inherently heat constrained. You would think that with this extra internal space, this extra thermal capacity, the fan, you'd be able to get a better experience out of a desktop device than you would on a laptop. And generally that's the case with most other devices, but it's not really the case here. And that really leads nicely into my conclusion. You see, after a few months, now 6 months nearly, of owning the MacBook Air, I am incredibly impressed with what Apple achieved without even changing the design of that product. Apple's conversion of the MacBook Air was really a transition specifically in the internals and had nothing to do with the actual shell of the product, whereas this feels like it was focused more on the design change than it was on the actual experience change of the M1. And that leads us nicely back to the questions that we started the video with. Does this make sense for someone who already has an M1 device like a MacBook Air or a MacBook Pro or a Mac Mini? The answer is probably not. In most cases, those devices are going to do just as well, and you're better off just buying a great display to go along with it to get 99% of the same experience that you get on the iMac. The next situation is, let's say you have a couple years old laptop that is kind of reaching towards the end of its life, and you want to know whether you want to replace your primary device with the iMac or have it alongside your dying laptop. I'd still probably say no. You're probably better off waiting a little bit longer for whatever MacBooks are released this year and getting that instead with a good monitor. Finally, let's get to families. This makes sense to have as a primary family computer for mom, dad, and kids all to use and to share. But That actually, I'm not so sure about. You see, in the last 10 years or so, a lot of the conversion that I've seen in consumer experience has been towards more personalized devices like smartphones. And so I've seen more and more families have personal laptops for their kids and for themselves. Of course, this is often very price restrictive, so it's difficult for many families to be able to afford a single laptop for every kid or for every individual. But that leads us really nicely into the price of the iMac. You see, at $12.99, I think this is an incredibly restrictive threshold of a price that is difficult to access for many families. And while it'd be a great device for the family to share, I think it would make a lot more sense for Apple to be able to offer something at a $9.99 price point in order to make it more accessible for many more families. In order to do that, they might have a weaker version of the M1 chip or a clock down version of the M1 chip and a 1080p display without the included mouse and keyboard. I'd wish that Apple was able to achieve a $9.99 price point, but who knows if they even consider that. If you are that family who can't afford a $12.99 desktop, but also can't afford a good laptop for every single family member to own, you're probably best off just getting an M1 Mac Mini at around $600 on discount, and then finding a good 27-inch monitor for around $150. That should last you a very long period of time and be nearly the same experience, if not sometimes a better experience than the iMac. So consider that if you are specifically looking for something along those lines. If it isn't already obvious, as much as I love the design of the new iMac, I'm not going to be keeping it around. So let me know down in the comments what you think of it and whether you are considering buying the brand new iMac. If you haven't already, be sure to like and get subscribed because it really helps the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.